Welcome back to the channel. I've been tagged a number of times and sent a number of questions about a video where a chap phones the local council and argues with them that he's under no obligation to notify them that he lives in the property, and therefore he concludes that he has no obligation to pay the council tax. Now, spoiler alert, you will have to pay council tax. That will be the conclusion if you are the person who is liable to pay it, and there's no exception and there's no discount or anything like that. So what I will talk about are the aspects of the judgment that he refers to, but why he may be wrong in his assessment that he doesn't have to pay the council tax, but just the particular points that he's in a very narrow sense correct in that there's no obligation to notify the local authority. Now, this came out of this case which went to the Court of Appeal. It was a fraud case on which there were 6 charges on the indictment, all of which were either providing false information with an attempt to make a gain or failing to disclose information. So if I jump over to the judgment now, I can show you the bit that I'm talking to in the Fraud Act of 2006. So under section 1.1, a person is guilty of fraud if in breach of any of the sections listed subsection 2, which provide different ways for committing the offence. And those sections are fraud by false representation, fraud by failing to disclose information, and fraud by abuse of position. Now, the one of particular interest here is this one here of failing to disclose information, because this related to charge 6 on the indictment, because the argument was that by failing to disclose the information that the person was living in that property, or there was a change of circumstances, and therefore failure to disclose the information of the change of circumstances and liability to pay the council tax, the prosecution argued that that was fraud by failing to provide that information. Now, the court looked at this and looked at it thoroughly and concluded that whilst there was obviously an obligation to pay council tax, there was no obligation upon the person to notify the local authority of change in circumstances, or that indeed that they were living in the property. The court provided in the conclusion that there is no room for the statutory implication of a legal duty to notify as contended for by the prosecution, and accordingly the appeal was dismissed. Now, this is not to be confused with the obligation to pay council tax. Just as the court provided, it shouldn't be confused the other way around. In other words, the obligation to pay council tax should not be equated with the obligation to notify the local authority of the change in circumstances in the property. And thus, that particular charge was terminated by the Crown Court judge. The judge ultimately drawing that conclusion because there was no evidence provided that there was a legal duty for the person to notify the local authority. In fact, the judge was even quite surprised by this. If we go back to the judgment, there's an exchange here between the judge and prosecuting counsel, and obviously counsel for the defence. The judge says, "I've asked Mr. Dennis, counsel, then, as now appearing before the prosecution, to point me to any legislative provision imposing such a duty. He has not sought or today been able to do so. I'm surprised if this is the case, that there is no provision imposing such a duty, but none is advanced. The prosecution, in short, say that it's obvious that there is such a legal duty, and that it's ludicrous to contend otherwise. This legal duty, obviously, to notify the local authority. Every household, they say, has an obligation to tell the local authority if they're residing in a property. Otherwise, how would any local authority have the necessary information to collect council tax?" Now, this is obviously the point that this chap brings up in the video, because the council can only ask for the council tax if they know who is in the property and get the relevant information, and therefore bill the council tax accordingly. Now, as I've said in a previous video, if the council does ask for that information, you can't ignore the request. That would almost certainly amount to failing to disclose information because there's been a direct request for that information. Equally, you can't lie about it. You can't say that no one is in the property, or you can't say that someone else is in the property, because that would be false information. So that would still amount to fraud. So whilst there's a very narrow interpretation that there was no legal obligation to provide it unless, of course, asked for that information, even the judge in this case was surprised. The judge goes on, "As I said to Mr. Dennis during argument, it would surely be a great surprise to everybody if there was no legal duty to give the local authority that information. I remain surprised that I've not been taken to a provision or a document evidencing such a duty. The fact is, however, I have not been. And then in this Court of Appeal judgment, it describes that the judge went on to refer to the fact that there was no other evidence, leaving aside the legal position, which could evidence the existence of such a duty of the facts of this particular case, and concluded in those circumstances that count 6 was unsustainable. Now that count, just to be clear, was solely in respect of failing to disclose the information to the local authority, and therefore false representations by failing to disclose with a view to make a gain. But ultimately, the court said there was no duty to provide that information, unless, of course, asked for that information, which would make this very different. But in the first instance, just by failing to disclose it, the court here was not provided any legislative provision that imposed such a duty, and therefore non-existed, and therefore that count was unsustainable. Therefore, there was a terminating ruling for that count on the indictment, because the judge wasn't taken to any provision. So whilst you might see that video and you might try to draw the two together, no obligation to notify the local authority, and therefore you might conclude that there's no obligation to pay the council tax. The two cannot be equated, just as the reverse wasn't true. The judge in this original judgment equally said that you cannot compare the obligation to pay council tax and automatically conclude that there was an obligation to notify the local authority. But the reverse is true as well. Just because there's no obligation to notify, it doesn't mean that there's no obligation to pay if provided with a bill. So if you're provided with a bill that's addressed to the household, the person who is responsible for paying that council tax, of course, it stands to reason you should be paying it. Otherwise, you may be facing serious trouble. So I hope you found that an interesting overview of that bit of the law that came into play with this video that's been circulating on social media, and just some comment on it. Just as another note on council tax as well, it's referred to as a priority debt, meaning you must pay this before things like your credit cards. And one of the most common reasons people are made bankrupt is by failing to pay their council tax when it falls due. There are various different enforcement methods, many of which are referred to in this judgment itself, but failing to pay the council tax when it does fall due and it does accrue, and obviously it will grow, and the council is not going to just wipe it away. The council is going to pursue you for that, and ultimately, after many steps have been exhausted, this is one of the very common reasons that people end up bankrupt, because they fail to pay the council tax, either because they can't pay it, or because perhaps as a result of some of videos like this, they believe they don't have to pay it and that it's not lawful. So just take this as a bit of a warning, because if council tax falls due and you do watch some of these videos in an attempt to find a reason and an excuse, perhaps a lawful reason not to pay the council tax, I would urge caution and always seek legal advice if you're in any way unsure about any of this. But my suggestion to you is that if you do fall due for council tax and you look up your local government website and you see how they deal with council tax with you, because even now for second homes, this is the subject for another video, but there are going to be increases for the council tax on second homes. Many of you might think that's not fair. Many of you might question how that can be determined in the first place, whether it's a first or second home, and so on. Let me know in the comments whether this has affected you already. Let me know if you have a second home and if you're worried about this affecting you and what you think about it. But as I say, just let this be a warning to you with regard to council tax. And in the meantime, I'd be really grateful if you like this video and subscribe. That does help my channel grow. It helps me to reach a wider audience. And as always, thank you for watching.